Hello, my fellow growers, gardeners, and curious earth lovers. Welcome back to Earthly Delights. Have you ever stood in a store aisle and felt that quiet panic rising in your chest as the shelves looked emptier than you ever imagined possible? Think back to early 2020. In what felt like a matter of days, the world slowed down, routines broke apart, and the things we thought would always be there suddenly disappeared. First, it was the obvious staples. Then flour became harder to find. And then one small, ordinary item revealed just how dependent modern life had made us: yeast. Those tiny packets had always seemed so unimportant, so easy to replace, so permanently available. But when they vanished, millions of people discovered something unsettling. Even with flour on the counter, water in the kitchen, and time at home, they still could not make a simple loaf of bread. Not because bread had become impossible, but because a living process we once understood had been handed over to a fragile system built on convenience, packaging, and perfect delivery. And if you're the kind of person who grows herbs on a windowsill, tends a few raised beds, mixes compost with your own hands, worries about what goes into your soil, or simply wants your home and garden to feed you more deeply, then this story matters to you more than you may think. Today I want to show you something both humble and remarkable, something old, practical, and unexpectedly powerful. Because what if the answer was never in the store aisle at all? What if the secret to more resilient, nourishing food had been sitting quietly in your kitchen this whole time, tucked inside one of the simplest crops we grow and eat, the potato? In this video, we're exploring potato fermentation, the 2019 technique that saved millions during the pandemic, a method rooted in biology, history, and the kind of practical wisdom every grower should know. And once you see what this humble potato can really do, you may never look at your garden, your pantry, or your own self-reliance the same way again. So before we dig in, make sure to subscribe to Earthly Delights and join our growing community of people who want healthier soil, stronger plants, and a more abundant life, one simple skill at a time. Topic: the guan, the great yeast disappearance and the illusion of modern supply chains. To understand why the potato matters so much in this story, we first need to look honestly at one of the biggest illusions of the modern kitchen. For generations, people were slowly taught to believe that yeast was something you had to buy, something made far away in a factory, sealed in a packet, stamped with a date, and placed on a store shelf for you to depend on. But that was never the full truth. Long before industrial food systems, people were baking and fermenting with living organisms gathered naturally from the world around them. For thousands of years, bread rose because human beings knew how to work with life itself. Then the pandemic arrived, and that illusion cracked wide open. What disappeared was not just an ingredient. What vanished was access to a biological process most people no longer knew how to begin on their own. And that is such an important lesson for anyone who grows food, tends soil, or cares about self-reliance. A system can look strong when every truck arrives on time, every warehouse stays full, and every shelf is neatly stocked. But the moment one link fails, the whole thing reveals how fragile it really is. Meanwhile, in quiet kitchens all over the world, some people never lost their rhythm. They already had jars of living starter on their counters, cultures that had been fed, maintained, and passed down for years, sometimes even generations. They did not panic because they were not waiting for a packet to rescue them. They understood how to keep a living food system going at home. And that brings us to a question every gardener, homesteader, and plant lover should sit with for a moment. Are we truly producing our food, or have we simply become consumers of a system that works beautifully only when nothing goes wrong? Because once we ask that honestly, we begin to see the potato not as a side dish, but as part of a much larger answer. Section 2. The biological truth about commercial versus wild yeast. Now at this point, some people may wonder, what is actually wrong with commercial yeast? After all, it works. It rises dough quickly, and it gives predictable results. And that is true. The yeast sold in stores is usually a single, cultivated strain, selected for one main job: to create gas fast and make bread rise on a schedule. For industrial baking, that speed is incredibly useful. In about an hour and a half, dough can be puffed up and ready to move along the production line. But when we look at food through the lens of biology instead of convenience, a different picture begins to emerge. Inside grains like wheat, there is a natural compound called phytic acid. It helps protect the seed, but in bread made with very fast fermentation, that compound is not given much time to break down. As a result, it can interfere with how well the body uses important minerals found in the grain. So even though the bread may look beautiful and fill the stomach, the deeper nutritional value is not always as available as it could be. This is where wild yeast and slow fermentation begin to tell a richer story. In a naturally fermented culture, yeast is not working alone. It lives alongside beneficial bacteria, and together they help transform the dough over time. That slower process supports the breakdown of compounds that would otherwise remain locked up, and it changes the structure of the bread in ways many people find easier to digest. This is one reason traditional fermentation has remained so meaningful across cultures for so long. It is not just about making dough rise. It is about letting nature finish the work. If you have ever eaten bread that left you feeling heavy, sluggish, or bloated, this is where the conversation becomes personal. The grains may not have changed nearly as much as the process has. And once we understand that, returning to wild fermentation stops feeling like an old-fashioned kitchen hobby and starts to look more like a practical way of restoring something valuable that modern food moved too quickly to preserve. Section 3. The potato's miraculous role in history. And once we begin to see fermentation as something deeper than a baking trick, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Why the potato? Why this simple crop, so common in the kitchen and so easy to overlook? To answer that, we have to travel back to the Andes of South America, high into a landscape of freezing nights, thin air, rocky ground, and conditions harsh enough to challenge almost any grower. And yet, from that demanding environment came one of the most important food plants in human history: the potato. The indigenous peoples of the Andes did not treat the potato as a mere staple. They understood it, honored it, and worked with it in extraordinary diversity. They cultivated thousands of varieties, each suited to different soils, elevations, temperatures, and microclimates. That kind of biodiversity is not chaos, it is wisdom. It is resilience built into the field itself. They also developed chuño, an ancient freeze-drying method that used the cold mountain nights and daytime sun to preserve potatoes into a lightweight food that could last for years. That knowledge helped sustain entire civilizations, including the Inca. When the potato later reached Europe, it was not welcomed with gratitude. It was feared, misunderstood, and even blamed for illness. But over time, people like Antoine Augustin Parmentier helped change that story. After surviving on potatoes during years of imprisonment, he became convinced of their value and helped persuade others to see them differently. From there, the potato transformed Europe's food supply, producing enormous yields and helping reduce recurring famine. But history also leaves us with a warning. In Ireland, dependence on a single potato type created a dangerously fragile system. When blight arrived in 1845, that lack of diversity turned one disease into a catastrophe. And for those of us who garden today, that lesson still matters. The potato is powerful, generous, and deeply useful, but only when we respect the laws of nature. Diversity is not decoration in the garden. It is protection. Section 4, the 2019 method, creating the infinite potato starter. So now let's bring all of that history, biology, and hard-earned wisdom right into the kitchen. If the potato has fed civilizations and supported resilience across generations, how can it help us capture wild yeast for ourselves? This is where the 2019 technique, that spread so widely during the pandemic enters the story. For many people, it felt like a revelation. But in truth, it was less of an invention and more of a rediscovery. Wild yeast is already all around you. It moves through the air, settles on fruit, rests on your hands, and lives quietly in the spaces where food and life meet. The real secret is not creating yeast from nothing. It is giving that invisible life a place where it can gather, wake up, and begin to work. And potato water is remarkably good at that. When potatoes are boiled, their starches soften and release into the water, creating a warm, cloudy liquid rich enough to encourage fermentation in a steady, natural way. The process is simple, but each part matters. Start with a large potato and boil it well, keeping the skin in the pot. Once it is fully soft, save the cooking water and let it cool until it is warm but no longer hot. That step is critical because too much heat will destroy the very life you are trying to welcome in. Then mash a little of the cooked potato back into the water to give the culture an extra source of starch. Pour it into a clean glass jar, cover it with a cloth or paper towel so it can breathe, and place it somewhere warm and dim. After a day or two, you should begin to see bubbles. Soon the mixture will develop a lightly sweet, earthy, yeasty smell, and that is when the magic becomes visible. You are no longer looking at potato water. You are looking at a living culture, a tool you can use in baking, feed over time, and renew again and again by adding fresh potato water to what remains. And that is why this method meant so much to so many people. It turned one humble crop into a practical source of continuity, nourishment, and confidence right at home. Section 5. The Dark Side of Fermentation. Risks and botulism. But this is exactly the moment where we need to slow down and respect what biology can do. As gardeners, growers, and people who care about real food, we know that nature is generous, but it is never careless. The internet loves to turn old skills into quick little hacks, but fermentation is not something to treat casually. The potato starter method is fascinating and useful, yes, but potatoes also come from the soil, and soil can carry botulism spores. In the open air, those spores are usually not the problem. The danger begins when people create the wrong conditions without realizing it, especially sealed, oxygen-free environments sitting at room temperature. That is why this part of the conversation matters so much. History has already shown what can happen when potatoes are handled carelessly in low oxygen conditions. There have been serious outbreaks linked to improperly stored potatoes, and similar risks have appeared when traditional foods were moved into modern, airtight containers that trap the wrong environment. In other words, the method is not the enemy. Misunderstanding the biology is. So if you are working with potato yeast, the rule is simple and non-negotiable. It must be able to breathe. Room temperature potato water should never be sealed tightly, and if anyone moves beyond a loose yeast culture into more advanced wet fermentation methods, that is where proper acidity, safe technique, and real caution become essential. This is not an area for guessing. Most of the time, your senses will tell you a great deal. A healthy culture smells pleasant, lightly sweet, and alive. It has the kind of aroma that suggests activity, not decay. But if it ever smells foul, rotten, or deeply off, do not try to rescue it. Throw it away and begin again. That is not failure, that is wisdom. Because working with living systems means understanding that safety is part of skill and respect is part of success. Section 6. Sustainable Systems and the Infinite Narrative. And once we understand both the promise and the responsibility of fermentation, we begin to see why the word infinite captured so many people during the pandemic. It was never just about making one jar of starter last longer. It was about something deeper. People were longing for continuity, for resilience, for systems that could keep going even when the larger world felt unstable. That same longing is what draws so many growers toward ideas like aquaponics and other closed-loop systems. Aquaponics is beautiful because it mirrors what nature has always done so well. Fish create waste, bacteria transform it into plant-available nutrients, and plants clean the water as they grow. What looks simple on the surface is actually a living partnership between organisms, each one supporting the next. And really, that is the same lesson this whole journey has been teaching us. Whether you are cultivating wild yeast in a jar, building healthy soil in a garden bed, or learning how water, roots, microbes, and nutrients move together in a balanced system, the principle does not change. Abundance is not something manufactured in isolation. It is something created through relationship. When we begin to understand those relationships, we stop acting like helpless consumers waiting for the next shortage, and we start becoming better stewards of the life all around us. And that shift in mindset may be one of the most valuable harvests of all. Section 7. Earthly Delights and Lessons for the Present. So what do we do with all of this now, here in our own lives, in our own kitchens, and in the gardens we tend today? The panic of the pandemic may have passed, but the deeper weakness it exposed has not disappeared. Food prices still rise, supply chains still stumble, and agricultural diversity is still shrinking in too many places. That means the lesson of the potato is not stuck in the past. It is still speaking to us now. Creating a potato yeast culture is not just a clever little emergency trick. It is a small, steady act of reclaiming food independence. It teaches us to stop looking at the world around us as if resources only come from a store. Whether you care for a backyard garden, a few containers on a balcony, or a handful of herbs on a windowsill, the principle is the same. Life is already gathering around you, waiting to be understood and used well. And one of the most beautiful lessons in all of this is that nature wastes nothing. If your potato starter gives you more than you need, that excess does not have to be discarded like something useless. It can become part of a quick batter, cooked into a crisp flatbread with a rich, tangy character all its own. Add a little flour, a pinch of salt, perhaps some herbs from the garden, and a drizzle of olive oil, and suddenly what looked like leftovers becomes a meal with real beauty and flavor. When we learn how starches transform, when we respect safety, and when we honor diversity in the crops we grow, we are doing more than making food. We are building a way of life that feels practical, abundant, and deeply rooted in the living world. And that is why the potato deserves far more respect than it usually gets. It is not just a cheap staple or a familiar side dish. It is a survivor, a teacher, and in many ways a quiet force that has shaped history. It has nourished civilizations, helped carry people through crisis, and reminded us, especially in uncertain times, that resilience often begins with the most ordinary things. The future feels less frightening when we remember that nature still offers us real tools for stability if we are willing to learn them. And when we work with the living biology of the earth, instead of depending entirely on distant systems, even something as simple as one potato can become a source of nourishment, confidence, and freedom. Thank you so much for spending this time with me here on Earthly Delights. If this journey through history, fermentation, and the wisdom of the garden spoke to you, be sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who loves growing, cooking, and living a little closer to the earth. And I want to leave you with one final thought. If a humble potato and a jar of water can remind us how much power still lives in our own hands, then what other beautiful answers might already be waiting for us, right there in our gardens, on our shelves, and in the soil beneath our feet? Keep growing, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next video.